The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
A victorious Congressman George Hansen talked this morning about those Idahoans who voted for him yesterday.
They aren't going to get carried away by a lot of nonsense put on by a few people trying to grind political axes. They're not about to have their votes stolen by special interests, whether it's bureaucrat or big money groups outside of Idaho. I think my victory was a victory for the people of Idaho.
Good evening. If there is one dominant political thought in Idaho today, it must be that George Hansen did it again. Whether you like him and vote for him or dislike him and vote against him, you must admit that he is a remarkable politician who persistently survives politically despite all the odds. Hansen beat his Republican challenger Dan Adamson by a vote of 51 to 49%, less than 2,000 votes out of a total of over 65,000 votes cast in the 2nd District. Hansen had been predicting a 60-40 split in the race with Dan Adamson. It turned out to be much closer than that. And Hansen told reporters in Pocatello this morning that one reason that it was so close was that organized labor in Bannock County and in Ada County turned out Democratic voters yesterday to vote against him in the Republican primary.
Well, it's hard to tell in a primary election. I think that if you discount the effort that was made in Boise by the labor unions and what they were able to effect in the crossover in there and in Pocatello, I think that basically we got what we expected, which was a pretty good-sized victory. It was offset by a couple of areas where those special interest groups were able to have an influence, but other than that, I think it was a very good victory.
At the time of this news conference this morning, Hansen had not yet talked to his challenger, Dan Adamson. He was asked what he would say to Adamson when they did talk.
What would I say? I guess it depends on course of conversation, but I guess I just have to say that you ran a hard race, fella, and hopefully now we can get together and keep the common enemy in sight, and that's to win for the Republican cause in November.
Hansen's victory yesterday sets the stage now for a rematch with Rexburg Democrat Richard Stallings, who Hansen beat by about 7,000 votes 2 years ago. And Hansen said today he's expecting a tough race.
I think we've always put a maximum effort in. You never take anything for granted. In Idaho, it's a swing state. You have Democrats and Republicans elected to high office in the state, and anyone can win. This seat was a Democrat seat before I took it years ago, and I think the only reason it stayed Republican, in a sense, is because of the fact that the people and I have had a very good rapport on the way we handle the office, my voting record, and what we do to give people the kind of service they want. So I suspect that on that basis that we have a very good chance of keeping it Republican. But it's a struggle. It's perfectly capable of switching parties if you don't tend it right.
Hansen also said today he believes his primary victory will help him in Washington, D.C., where the House Ethics Committee is studying whether to take disciplinary action against him over his 4 felony convictions for failure to file proper financial disclosure forms. We're going to spend the first few minutes of our broadcast tonight with some analysis of the Hansen victory. We'll later on look at some of the more important state legislative contests decided yesterday, and also look ahead to the Democratic presidential caucuses on Thursday in light of Senator Gary Hart's surprising 2-to-1 win in the primary there yesterday over Walter Mondale. Our analysis comes tonight from 3 journalists: Rod Grammer, the political editor of the Idaho Statesman newspaper in Boise; Randy Staples, the editorial page editor of the Idaho State Journal in Pocatello; and Jim Fisher, who covers politics for the Lewiston Tribune in Lewiston. Rod, you wrote this morning that although George Hansen won yesterday, that his base of support has eroded.
Well, Mark, this was the closest election Hansen has had in many years. In 1974, when he regained the seat from Orville Hansen, he won that election by 2,000 votes. He won last night by less than 2,000 votes, so I think it's clear that his support across the district is eroding.
How did he do it?
Well, I think he basically went to all those people who have supported him in the past and told what he said was his side of the story about his legal problems and convinced those people that he was the victim of selective prosecution by liberal bureaucrats. Hansen is perhaps the most formidable campaigner in the state of Idaho, and he's very effective, especially in small groups, one-on-one, one-on-10, something like that. He's been holding these open houses all across the district.
Randy Staples in Pocatello, let me ask you if you agree with Rod's assessment that Congressman Hansen's support has eroded.
Yes, I think so. I think one of the best pieces of evidence may lie in something that Hansen said when he was predicting a 60% win. Now, Hansen's optimum condition is going to be a small turnout because his loyalists are going to turn out to the polls more reliably than his opponents will. So when he was predicting a 60% win, and when he got the kind of turnout that's going to be the best possible for him, and he still doesn't wind up with more than 51%, I think something is wrong in his base of support, and I think he has got to start looking around and figuring out whether the support he thinks is there, and possibly that he has been told is there, really is.
You heard him on the videotape in Pocatello this morning say that organized labor had orchestrated a crossover vote where normally Democratic voters were voting in the Republican primary. Any evidence of that?
No, I haven't seen any evidence of that. In any event, I think the Democrats those Democrats that did go over were probably split. A lot of Democratic leaders were advising Democrats to vote in favor of Hansen, feeling that they could beat him easier than they could Adamson. So I think the Democratic crossover, however extensive it may have been, was split between the two candidates.
Mark, can I break in here for a minute?
Yes, sir. Please do.
With a question. Nevertheless, though, Randy, wouldn't you imagine that Richard Stallings is grinning from ear to ear today with the prospect of facing George Hansen, who appears about as weak as he could right now, considering that he did get the nomination?
Well, he has said consistently that he wants to run against Hansen, but I have to think that he must be of two minds about that. After all, Hansen did beat him once before. He's a very formidable candidate. He remains purely as a candidate going out on the stump, talking to people, much more formidable than Adamson would have been. I think that it would have been a virtual draw between the two of them as far as which one Stallings really would have more wanted to face.
Your assessment of that, Rod?
Well, I think that one of the things in the last few weeks, Stallings has sounded very confident about this race, and I think that's one of the biggest mistakes he can make, being too confident about Hansen. Anyone who writes Hansen off is a fool, because Hansen's political reporters, political analysts have written his political obituary more than once, and he always makes fools of them. And I think Stallings has to face this as an underdog and go into it that way.
You also wrote in your piece today that you thought maybe Adamson's gaffe that he made here a few days ago, just before the election, about saying that he had pity on eastern Idaho voters who had supported Hansen for so long, hurt him in that part of the state.
I asked him about that last night when I interviewed him about his loss, and he discounted that. But I talked to Russ Webb, who's the Democratic chairman over in Bonneville County today, and he thinks that remark really hurt Adamson. He said people were still talking about it this week and last week. I think that had a big factor in this loss here.
Randy, you agree?
Well, I'm not sure how many votes it may have turned from Adamson to Hansen is my problem with that. I think that it probably solidified Hansen's people. I think that it may have irritated a number of people. I'm not sure how many people would have switched their votes on the basis of it, though.
Well, as we look ahead to this race now, a rematch of 2 years ago between Stallings and Hansen, you've already talked about how Stallings should not underestimate George Hansen, and I think we're all smart enough, I hope, not to do that anymore. What does Richard Stallings have to do now to make a credible campaign? Randy?
Well, I think he has to continue to organize and raise money as hard as he can. He has to simply devote enough time to it. He has to work in large and small groups. He has to be sure to try to undermine, to some extent, Hansen's incredibly strong base of support in the upper Snake River Valley. And one would think that he would have a shot at doing that, since he comes from Rexburg himself. He has to build on the kinds of anti-Hansen votes that have been cropping up with greater regularity in Ada County, places in the Magic Valley, places like that. And he probably has to assume a much higher profile than he has done in the past. And that probably means coming on a little tougher.
Is the issue, regardless of what we all say about the importance of other things, is it going to be George Hansen and his legal problems?
I think it'll come down to that. It almost has to.
So are you saying that Stallings has to be tough on that issue and bring it up and talk about it?
I think he has to bring it up and talk about it. I think he has to be a little bit careful too that he doesn't quite step over the line, that he isn't perceived as slinging mud, because that would be the first thing that Hansen would jump back on. Hansen is such an excellent counterpuncher that Stallings can give him only the slightest opportunity, and Hansen will make the most of it.
Rod, what's the chance that the Hansen legal problems will not be sorted out, resolved one way or the other by the time voters get a chance to vote again on George Hansen?
Well, Mark, you can bet that they won't be settled. I think a lot of people think that this will only be settled when he's sentenced and he starts serving his sentence, whatever that is, prison time or whatever. And he can delay that for up to 2 years, perhaps. So I don't think this thing's going to be settled. Through appeals and various things. And every time, let's say the Ethics Committee comes out against him, well, he can say, well, the Ethics Committee is made up of a bunch of liberals. You know, this thing is, he can create these straw men from now until November. It's never going to be settled before the election, and he can keep raising these ghosts all the way along.
But Rod, there's another question too, is when is George Hansen going to start voting in the House of Representatives again?
I think that's a key issue. When I was over with Hansen last week going to these open houses, that question came up again and again and again among his loyal supporters. When are you going to be able to vote? And I think as November wears on, you know, votes on El Salvador, votes on the budget, various things, that's going to become more of an issue. And that's something that Stallings should grab and run on. That's something that Adamson, I don't think, really grasped.
Well, Rod, what was Hansen's answer to that question as far as when he will respond?
Well, his answer was, well, he's doing this as a courtesy to the House. He's not voting. He can vote anytime he wants to. And he said that he will certainly vote after he's reelected. But I think that if Stallings plays that issue right, he can make some inroads there.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, we're going to move along to the legislative primary races that were decided yesterday. There were several of them in Idaho, the highlight being the defeat yesterday of 5 incumbent Republican legislators. One of the major legislative upsets occurred in Kootenai County, where incumbent Republican Bill Moore lost by nearly 1,000 votes to political newcomer Dennis Carlson. Moore has been one of the most conservative Republicans in the Senate. Carlson, a Post Falls farmer, had criticized him for votes against an education reform bill and against a lottery constitutional amendment. In south-central Idaho's Magic Valley, 2 incumbent Republicans lost. John Brooks of Gooding lost lopsidedly to Gary Robbins. Brooks had been a staunch opponent of subordination of the Swan Falls water right on the Snake River. Robbins, who farms near Dietrich, favors subordination. Swan Falls subordination was the major issue in this race, too, where another incumbent Republican, Gordon Hollifield, lost a closer race to Jerome farmer Waldo Martins. Martins does not seem to differ much with Hollifield on other issues other than the water rights question. In an Ada County race that featured a direct head-to-head matchup between incumbents, the moderate Republican was the loser, Lyman Winchester defeating Jerry Deckert by a 54-46% margin. Winchester, who lives in Cuna, has been a conservative spokesman in the House for several years, while Deckert, from Eagle, had become in one term a spokesman for the moderate Republican faction that just a few months ago pushed through a sales tax increase. The 5th incumbent to lose yesterday was Republican Carol Dean in Canyon County. Dean lost a countywide race there by a 53-47 margin. Bob Schaefer had criticized Dean for saying that he would vote against a tax increase when Dean actually voted for a sales tax hike during the last legislature. Jim, let me ask you first about that Moore-Carlson race. Our analysis was that the lottery played heavily in that issue. Moore was one of the more vociferous opponents of a lottery constitutional amendment. And that is a big issue in your part of the state particularly.
I think it's more of an issue in the Panhandle, a little further north than it is in the north-central part of the state. But I don't think it's just the lottery, because if you look at some of the other races up there, they don't follow that same trend. I think that one thing that might have helped do more in was just the fact that he was a more vocal conservative than, say, House member Frank Findley, who did receive his party's nomination, although he was running against a strong candidate.
Who's every bit as conservative, I think, as
right,
as
but also quieter.
Right.
I think some of Moore's statements that have been well publicized, for example, during the 1983 session, when he said that fear would prevent a woman who was truly raped from becoming pregnant. I think those things got around, and I think they hurt him.
Randy, let me ask you, do you see any particular trends that run through these races, that particularly the ones we just ran through here?
Well, about the only trend that I can see in races around the state, not just these but others, is that the more controversial candidates tended to lose. Very often in Idaho politics, I think controversy can help a candidate. This time it didn't seem to be the case. Moore was a controversial senator. Hollifield and Brooks became controversial representatives by virtue of the Swan Falls decision. And I think you can find that kind of pattern in a number of races around the state. Hansen did not do as well as he often has. And a number of local races, that seems to have been the same pattern.
Yeah.
That's the only one I can pick up.
Swan Falls really was the issue, was it not, Rod, and particularly in the Brooks and Hollifield races?
I think so, Mark. Both Hollifield and Brooks probably lost those races because of that issue. It was kind of interesting, though, that the speaker, Stivers, down in Twin Falls, won, even though he was on the same side as Brooks and Hollifield. But definitely in those two races, that was the issue.
Well, Tom Stivers did lose, in a way, perhaps two of his most loyal lieutenants in the House in John Brooks and Gordon Hollifield.
I think that was the story yesterday, Mark, was not so much the Conservatives winning or losing, but who lost. The people who lost, John Brooks, Gordon Hollifield, Carol Dean, and Jim Golder here in Ada County, who dropped out, are all key supporters of the speakers. And I think that the real story is what is going to happen in the leadership race next fall. And I think these defeats will make it more difficult for Stivers to get reelected as Speaker of the House.
Any dissenting opinion on that, Randy?
No, I agree with that. I think Stivers was not in terribly good shape going in or leaving the last session anyway. He seemed to be losing his relative control over the caucus as it was, and certainly every one of these losses is going to hurt him a little.
And certainly, Jim, will there be a different look on the Revenue and Taxation Committee, a key committee that both Brooks and Hollifield were very senior members on?
That's true, but if Stivers is reelected Speaker, of course, he will control who goes on. I think that we should note here that for every moderate who beat a conservative, there is the opposite close by. Already mentioned the Findlay Bill Curry race up in the north. We have another one down besides the Deckard-Winchester. You've got the Dean Chatburn-Boyd Hill race. You have the Ray Enfanger-Ed Smith race. There are a number of them in which conservatives did win, so I don't think that we should begin writing Stivers off yet. I think we need to look further.
Reapportionment was a theme in some of these races. Do we know anything more about how reapportionment might affect the future of Idaho politics just by looking at these results yesterday? Jim?
I sure don't yet.
Okay. Randy?
I think they've had isolated individual results, but I'm not sure that there are any particular trends you can extract from them.
Thought on that, Rod?
I think people are confused, and I'm confused, and I don't think I want to guess either.
Okay, well, fair enough. 3 non-guesses. The other big primary election surprise yesterday was how well Colorado Senator Gary Hart did in the non-binding presidential primary. Idaho Democrats overwhelmingly favored Hart yesterday over former Vice President Walter Mondale, the margin about 2-1 statewide. Mondale said today that the size of his loss was due to a lack of time and money to campaign in Idaho. Hart, of course, made an appearance here last week. Hart today appealed to Idaho voters to attend the party's caucuses tomorrow and vote for him. In those county caucuses tomorrow, Democrats will actually select the delegates to the national convention. The leaders of the Mondale and Hart campaigns in Idaho join us now. Larry LaRocco of Boise chairs the Mondale campaign, and Steve Shaw of Nampa chairs the Hart campaign. What effect will this have, gentlemen, on the caucuses tomorrow? First you, Mr. Shaw.
I think the principal effect that the showing of Senator Hart yesterday will be a sign to people that he does have a strong campaign and a strong candidacy here in Idaho, and an appeal to people statewide, because we had young, elderly, farmers, business people, all kinds of people represented here in Idaho campaigning for us. And I think perhaps folks who were, say, undecided or not quite sure of going to the caucus or whom to support in the caucus, by seeing a 2-1 margin victory for Senator Hart, they may now decide to go to the caucus and support him, realizing that the people have cast their votes in the primary and they wish to ratify that in the caucus on Thursday night.
Well, Mr. LaRocco, the flip side of that, I guess, is that some people think that Gary Hart might have won the primary yesterday by a 2-1 margin, but because of the Mondale camp's organization, that they'll lose the caucuses by the same amount, meaning the Hart campaign will lose the caucuses. Possible?
Well, we've got a strategy and a campaign that was oriented towards the caucuses all along. Our strategy was to maximize the number of people that went to the caucuses, to get them out and vote in a good grassroots type of organization, and to get as many as we can. We haven't changed. Obviously, last night's results were not in our game plan. 2-1 loss was not cause for celebration at the Mondale camp, but we're weathering that. We're intensifying our efforts, and we're well organized in the state. We've got 36 counties organized with good coordinators who know the score, who know how to organize for caucuses, and we're simply continuing with that process, and we're going to do as best as we can.
Some folks are going to raise the fairness question about whether it's fair for Gary Hart to win 2-1 over Mondale and then come away with less than the lion's share of the delegates, which is entirely possible, right?
Well, I think they could raise that question. I think it probably exists in a lot of people's minds. It adds certainly to the confusion of the whole process about what we're doing here to get delegates to the state convention and to the national convention. But the fact is that those are the rules right now, and we've got to play by the rules, and we've organized our campaign around that. Every campaign has a strategy for the situation, and we've adjusted to that.
In the larger context, Mr. Shaw, what is Gary Hart's showing here yesterday say about how sort of rank-and-file Democrats feel about the guy who at this point would appear to be rolling toward the nomination?
I'm not quite sure what it says about the rank-and-file Democrats. There's been the allegation that you had some marginal Democrats or weak Democrats help out in the primary yesterday, and the true Democrats will appear on Thursday night. Quite frankly, I think that's a bunch of nonsense, because I think that we have the support of a number of people who are in the rank and file of the Democratic Party and other key groups that exist within the confines of the Democratic Party. But I think that we have a very good, solid organization as well. And I know just a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Andrews was saying that he felt that Senator Hart would probably win the caucus as well. I don't know what has changed in the interim to change that prediction, but I think that we stand a very good chance of doing quite well in the caucus on Thursday night, because people who took the time to go out and vote last night will do the same thing Thursday evening.
Mr. LaRocca?
Well, there's been a pattern across the country of Walter Mondale doing well in the caucus states. There's no question about it. He does simply better in those states because of the organization, and he does attract the rank and file. I was with Governor Andrews this morning, and when we met with some press people, and I think he was very optimistic even about tomorrow's returns in light of last night's returns. So we remain optimistic about how we're going to do, and again, we're simply going to maximize it. I want to bring to your attention that this scenario was played out before in Wisconsin and in Vermont, where Senator Hart did win the beauty contest, and then Walter Mondale bounced back and won the caucuses. Organization has a lot to do with it, and I think that's where we shine in the state right now.
Could I add a point of correction there?
Yeah.
That is true for Wisconsin. In a 600,000 vote race, Gary Hart won Wisconsin primary by only 20,000 votes. In Vermont, he won the primary with 71% of the vote, and then in the Vermont caucus won it with 51% of the vote to 32% for Walter Mondale. So it is true in Wisconsin, however it is not true in Vermont.
But the case is that we've bounced back after the popular vote, and I don't think you're going to see tomorrow night a 2-1 edge by Gary Hart here. I think you'll see that decline.
Let me bring the reporters back in this. Rod Grammer, this just come down to a pretty screwy way to select delegates to the National Convention?
I think a lot of people, Mark, are asking themselves, why is the party of the people doing it this way? I think that if Hart wins the primary yesterday and loses the caucuses Thursday night, people are going to, the average guy is going to say, hey, something's screwy here. And it's undemocratic to do it that way, even though, as Larry pointed out, it's playing by the rules. But I think a lot of people are going to ask themselves that question.
Do you see in this, any of you, what a lot of the national press is writing, that there is just this underlying concern that Walter Mondale, that Democrats are not comfortable with the fact that Walter Mondale is likely to be the party's nominee? Randy?
Well, I'm not quite so sure that that's the case here. I think there may have been a number of other factors. For one, I think Senator Hart's visit to Idaho may have helped him a little bit. I think that some of the kind of rank and file who might have been some of Mondale's strongest supporters may in fact have crossed over in the southern half of the state to the 2nd District congressional race on the Republican side. I think there are a number of different factors too, and of course the fact that Hart is a Western senator is going to play well in Idaho, and I think ties possibly to the Carter administration, when you consider that Carter got very low marks in the 1980 election in Idaho. Ties to the Carter administration aren't particularly going to help Mondale.
Well, Jim Fisher from a Democratic area in Nez Perce County in northern Idaho, do you see much interest on the part of Democrats in this fight between Hart and Mondale at this point?
Among activist Democrats, I do. I think that Mr. LaRocco is right in saying that mainline party activists are definitely working, most of them are definitely working for Mondale. Younger people that I see oftentimes are working for Hart. As far as the question of dissatisfaction with the candidate goes, I think that there's just kind of a vague feeling of dissatisfaction with the choices that are being offered, and I wouldn't be surprised that if Gary Hart were the front runner, you might see just as many votes against him for the same reason.
Yeah, you subscribe to that theory, gentlemen?
Well, it could happen, of course, that people are contrary and they'll vote against the front runner. I do agree with Randy that I think the showing last night was due to the fact that Senator Hart is a Westerner and he did make the appearance here. But we do have a lot of mainline people who are simply going to be active in this campaign all the way until the caucus is at 8 p.m. tomorrow, and we'll see how it turns out.
Mr. Shaw, is it possible that despite the wonderful decorum with which you two gentlemen conduct yourselves here, that the Democratic Party is going to have some difficulty putting it back together if this fight continues beyond Idaho and all the way to the convention?
Well, I don't think Larry and I are going to go out in the parking lot and
I'm sure
fight
you
between
won't.
our cars or anything. And I don't foresee any problem at all. There are many folks around here who have been involved in the Democratic Party in Idaho much longer than I, and they say essentially the same thing. Secretary Andrews has said that as well, that sure, we're fighting for our particular candidates now, but after the party's convention in San Francisco in July, whomever the nominee turns out to be, we'll rally around that nominee and work hard for the election in November. I don't foresee any problem at all.
Mr. LaRocco?
I really don't see a problem. I think that this party is really committed to unity, and I think that we understand the role of the opposition party, and that is, number one, to oppose. And whom we're opposing is the president who now sits in the White House. And I think after we get finished with this process that has dragged on for a long, long time in this country that we're going to pull together, I could sit here and say I think a Mondale-Hart ticket might look pretty good, and I think Steve might say a Hart-Mondale ticket might look pretty good, but the fact is that we're thinking about healing any wounds that have opened up during this process and get on with the show, and we're going to have a great summer all the way to November, I think.
Okay, well, I guess we'll see. Mr. Shaw, Mr. LaRocco, Rod Grammer, we thank you for joining us tonight, gentlemen in Boise. Jim Fisher in Moscow, thank you, Jim. Good to have you. And Randy Staples in Pocatello, we thank you for being with us tonight, too. That's our time for tonight. I'll be off for a few days, and Gene McNeil will be sitting in here. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.